Matthew Stewart, about, in particular, your two books, Nature's God and An Emancipation of the Mind, which I have here. Particularly the second one, which has just been recently published. But I thought I'd start off by asking you to introduce yourself, your background, and how you became interested in the subject of radical philosophy, and particularly as it pertains to the American revolutions.
Yeah. Well, so how now I have to describe myself, put myself in a little box. That's good. We all have to do that. So for people who haven't come across any of my books, which is the vast majority of the human population, let's say that I've been a writer for the past 30 years. Before that, I guess I was formed in some sense as a student of philosophy, and I did a doctoral degree in philosophy. I've always been interested in the history of philosophy and the history of ideas. I've had a checkered career, I've worked in other fields, and I've never been formally employed in the academic world. I'm a freelance writer. As to how I came to the history of ideas, and in particular to the American thing. Look, it started with a general interest in philosophy. I think many people, I'm sure many people listening to this would be just interested in the questions that philosophy brings up, and they turn to it for any number of good reasons. But I always have thought of philosophy as something that's very important in explaining how the world has ended up being structured the way it is, not just in terms of our understanding of the physics of it, but of our social reality. I think that there's a big unexplained chunk that connects the really interesting parts of the history of philosophy with interesting developments in the modern world. And one of those developments is the American Revolution, the rise of this kind of new form of government, the liberal democracy that now has kind of dominates the modern world, but isn't totally secure. That's kind of abstract, but I guess that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, well, we'll get into the nitty gritty, I suppose. Yeah, you kind of well, I wanted to ask about that, about your style. You said that you've not been professionally employed in academia, which is no bad thing. but but you say in your books, you say it's kind of old-fashioned style of history that you're writing, that's ideas based, whereas a lot of history now, particularly academic history, is sort of social history, things like that. So yeah, what do you know for what reason do you think that this is missing from most kind of histories? Why is it overlooked, this philosophical focus?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I do think that the way in which we've structured the pursuit of knowledge in the modern world, the university system and all that goes with it, it does leave open certain gaps, or it has certain you know tendencies. And I do think that they need to be corrected. So I should step back and say that I'm not against social history, looking at the details of how people actually live their lives. And in fact, one book that I published recently that you didn't mention, so I'll plug it, is called The 9.9%. And it's a very close look at the sociology and the demography of the emerging class system in the United States, and it's very much focused on those social details. But here's the difference, and here's where I think some of the modern approach to history goes a bit off. Um, all of those things matter because they shape our ideas, and then our ideas turn around and shape the world. And so my argument in that 9.9% book was that this rising inequality, this incredible complexity of the modern economy has created a kind of irrationality in people. And then this irrationality gets projected onto these pretty bad ideas that people use to govern themselves. And one of the correctives for those bad ideas, well, there's two kinds of correctives. One is you try to deal with the fundamentals and you create a more just society. Um, but part of doing that, part of creating a just society is creating a society in which you have free, rational discourse, where people get educated and where you kind of you try to resolve these irrationalities in the understanding with the mind. And that's, I think, really, really important. That's how it's that combined with social change that generates some degree of progress in the human world. And to bring it around to my most recent book, because you were kind enough to bring that up, that's, I think, a big part of the story in the Emancipation. So a purely materialist explanation of what happened. How is it that you had this slave system in the Western Hemisphere and in the United States, and how did it suddenly end, in the United States at least, in a civil war that brought about emancipation? Well, if you stick it to the level of purely material social explanations, frankly, I don't think I don't think you arrive at an answer. I think that you need to bring in the fact that the people who are acting in history at the time were deeply involved in philosophy. People like Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and these other people that I focus on in my book, they weren't just, picking up the random philosophy book out of some kind of, purely material interest. They were reading and engaging with it. And then that turned around and shaped the way in which they acted in history. So I guess I'm going for a kind of synthetic position here. I hope you don't mind, where I want to keep a lot of that detailed social history, but I just think it's really, really important to connect it with the big ideas.
Do you reckon that you're
Yeah.
not that I want to get sidetracked into the politics and sociology of academia, but do you reckon that you would be able to write these books if you were, stuck in the ivory tower? Or do you have a certain freedom that comes with being, well, freelance?
Yeah. Oh, I mean, absolutely. No, I think that I mean there are two pressures that work in different directions in academia. So one is the one that you identified, where there's kind of a need to go hyper specialist and develop super expertise, a kind of micro knowledge, as it were, where you're carving out the back hind leg of an insect kind of thing. Um, uh, and then there's another drive, which is toward a sort of, pure abstraction, where you kind of have to generate these abstruse theoretical models based on, analysis of some canonical texts. And I think those are both really limiting. And my books don't fall into those categories. And frankly, I don't think I would have gotten tenure if I had stayed within that system, or I would have basically been compelled to produce much more respectable work. That said, my work relies heavily on the scholarship that's generated by people in the academy. So I'm not brushing the whole thing off as useless or a waste of time, but I just think that it's important to have this extra space where you can take advantage of this tremendous amount of knowledge that's being generated, but kind of bring it home. Make it useful, make it important. And relevant. And back to this emancipation thing. I hope I've done it in a way that makes clear that what happened then, this emancipation, even though it was only a very partial success, even though it then brought forth a number of reversals, not nearly as enduring as one might have hoped, despite all of that, it's actually still really relevant now. It's not just relevant because it's the story of how we became what we are, but because it reflects certain dynamics that are still in operation, that still affect the way that we think about the world and how we act in it. So I think that kind of making the scholarship useful and relevant, I think it's really important, and it's pretty hard to do within the academy. Because I think I could say from personal experience, you won't get hired.
Well, let's delve into that then. These philosophical ideas, which underpin emancipation of the mind. and nature's God as well. This is a big question, and I don't know how you'll manage it, but what is radical philosophy? And in a nutshell, what is this radical philosophy that you identify as a thread through the American Revolution, Mark One and Mark Two? Or what is Epicurus's dangerous idea, as you put it in Nature's God?
So, I mean, it starts with uh, an opposition to something. So let me define what the alternative is. So what I argue is that the alternative to radical is common. So and the basic idea here is that human experience is it's not purely open, it's not purely infinite. It comes with certain kind of recurring conditions. People tend to form certain kinds of ideas when they think about morality, when they think about justice, when they think about the political order, when they think about what it means to be a person and all that. So there's a kind of common set of ideas that come naturally to people. And I think that, for example, most religion reflects these common ideas very well, right? It reflects a certain idea about the self as being this kind of fixed substance. It reflects this idea that morality can only come from a command from above, and it's constituted by obedience. There's a whole series of other common conceptions that I think people form, and that you can see written across most of human history. In most of human history, the forms of governance are not that varied. I mean, it's kind of astonishing, but like every fairy tale has a king and a prince, and most of history is the story of these, ruling clans and ruling families. And sure, there are the, exceptional odd formations here and there, but by and large, human beings have had these common conceptions, and they've led to certain forms of political and social organization in a predictable way. And here's the problem. They are they're often bad. They often limit human freedom. They are often deeply oppressive. So radical philosophy starts with the idea that you can somehow go beyond these common notions, that you can, through just thinking, through reason, you can get to more fundamental ideas that can then turn around and be used to structure societies, to structure human interactions, and also to help structure people's lives. So radical is the opposite of common, and it's a potential foundation for political and personal life. I'd say beyond that, radical involves breaking from specific sets of conceptions having to do with morality. So radical philosophy, by and large, views reason or some sort of cognate as the foundation of morality, and rejects the sort of transcendental or obedience model of morality. Radical also means moving away from the idea of the self as a fixed substance, and insists on seeing the self as more of a dynamic or active process. It sees justice as something that's always partially realized in human society, but never fully so. And just to round that out, because I know this is all a little abstract, I'll throw out some names I think are important. I think that there are radical philosophers throughout history. I don't think it's like one period in time that just magically produced them. I think these radical ideas, they kind of emerge naturally from human experience. They've emerged at all times and places, but they don't always reach a critical mass that has real power and impact. And they don't always kind of come crystallized with, let's say one author who manages to get them all down into a text. So examples of people who have done it, as I suggest in my books, are in the ancient world, you had Epicurus, you had the ancient atomists, Democritus, Leucippus. In varying degrees, the other representatives of some of that ancient philosophy too, I would include in that mix. And then in the early modern world, you had philosophers like Giordano Bruno, and the one who figures very prominently in Nature's God, Spinoza, all of whom I think articulate some form of this radical philosophy that I'm talking about. And then the case I make is that when you look at the particulars, their works had a direct influence on the people who were then actually creating these new structures in the modern world. So however flawed those structures are, I think they include a piece of this sort of this radical insight, and it's a very powerful and important piece.
Hmm. So how, well, you say in both of these books that this philosophy is essentially atheistic. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I mean, the essential here is really important because throughout history, there's so many different ways of talking about theism, atheism, and all that it's kind of unfair and simplistic to map it into sort of modern categories of what we mean by that. Even so, I think you can do some sort of mapping. Um, so a first qualification to make is that a lot of these original philosophers that I described as essentially atheistic are formally theistic. Okay, so Spinoza's Ethics, his main work, the first section is called Of God, and it includes a proof of the existence of God. And Epicurus actually says, oh yeah, there are gods out there. They're sort of in interstellar space, and they have really, really wonderful lives. So I'm not saying that that these radical philosophers who shaped our world are all formally atheistic, saying there is no God kind of thing. Um, but when you examine what it is they're saying, um, I think it does qualify as being essentially incompatible with the conceptions associated with all forms of theistic religion. Um, so any form of theistic religion generally says there is a deity, and that deity is responsible for creating the world. There are various permutations. Sometimes the deity only creates part of the world. Sometimes the deity, does it and steps back. Sometimes the deity is right there, making sure that your salt shaker is full or whatever. But they always have some sort of agent acting within some kind of bigger universe. And the philosophy of these radicals, like Spinoza, is simply it's not just incompatible; it refutes that. Um, so in technical terms, like Spinoza, you can call him a pantheist. Epicurus, I guess there's some other term, maybe like a you know indifferent theist. Um, but their conceptions essentially involve eliminating the theistic conceptions of ordinary religion. Now, why is that important? You could say, well, that's just their theology and it doesn't really matter. But as a matter of history, these were the first people who actually articulated very clear conceptions of individual rights and of democracy as the most legitimate or the strongest form of government. So just as a matter of history, it's very interesting to know that the people who generated the revolution were these essential atheists. But I think it goes beyond that because my argument is that what we call liberalism has a much stronger foundation than most people think. Most people just kind of conceive of it as arbitrary assertion of certain individual rights that you just have to kind of take on faith. I don't think that's the way it works at all, at least in terms of its real uh, logical structure. But I think that logical structure comes with a complete rejection of transcendental theories of morality and of any explanations of the nature of the world that are traced back to arbitrary theistic causes.
Hmm.
So you, when I say that that kind of liberalism that I'm talking about is founded on essentially atheistic principles, I guess I mean it. I think that sure, there are plenty of theistic liberals, but I guess since this is a podcast, I can just say it. I think that they're kind of confused.
Yeah, no, yeah, say what you like. We're um, um, yeah, it reminds me of something that somebody who's definitely an atheist, formally and otherwise, Richard Dawkins. I think he described deism as watered down theism and pantheism as sexed up atheism. So make of that what you will. But that just reminds
Yeah,
me of
yeah,
that.
no, I completely agree with that, and I have that in my book, in Nature's God. I mean, I do say, and I think it's true that yeah, pantheism is just kind of, I didn't use sexed up. That would be more of a Richard Dawkins expression, but pantheism is just sort of atheism in nicer clothing.
So I want to focus on an emancipation of the mind, but very quickly then, can you explain how this philosophy um, was manifested in the American Revolution with Jefferson and Paine and Ethan Allen and Thomas Young and other people, the pursuit of happiness, things like that? How did this actually manifest in the world?
Yeah, I mean, so the American Revolution has gotten a lot of bad press because I think it's been represented very often as just a kind of socially static revolution where a local elite, the people who happen to run in the colonies, rebel against another elite, and the people lower in the social order don't, have much of a say. But that's not really an accurate representation. It's a partial representation. It's got some truth, but it's missing key parts of the story. The parts of the story it's missing, to give them names, are people like Thomas Paine, who was not a representative of any elite, and Thomas Young, who's even less well known, but who was an Irish immigrant, rising up from the bottom and always speaking for the people, called an Apollo of the ignorant, they called him. Now, these people, they read a lot of philosophy, and that philosophy, it showed up in two ways. It showed up in their actions. So they created things like the Boston Committee of Correspondence, the Sons of Liberty, and things like that, that were in some ways the kind of practical manifestation of these very democratic, very liberal beliefs. But then it also showed up in a lot of the texts that they started writing to sort of justify what they were doing. So Thomas Young, for example, wrote the Constitution of Vermont, which is the first constitution to get rid of slavery, and also one of the really the first democratic constitution of the modern world, along with the Pennsylvania Constitution, which he also wrote. These ideas, which, again, I trace back to, this radical tradition from Epicurus down through Spinoza and Locke and Hobbes and so on. These ideas then show up in the documents that everyone knows, the formal documents that kind of tell America what it is. And that's first and foremost the Declaration of Independence, but then also the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And those ideas that show up there, as I say, you can trace them back to these radical philosophical sources. You can also trace them back to the critical role that some of these revolutionaries, actual revolutionaries, not just kind of anti-tax rebels, some of their activity.
So, well, I mean, that leads quite nicely then into an emancipation of the mind, because there, when I was reading these side by side, I noticed that well, for one thing, you're a bit more down on the Constitution in Emancipation of the Mind than you were in Nature's God. I don't know if that was a conscious shift, but you're quite harsh about the Constitution in the latter book. And you say in Emancipation of the Mind that people like Lincoln and Douglas and Theodore Parker should be more celebrated than the likes of Jefferson and Washington, that they deserve the real place in history, the refounders as opposed to the founders. So yeah, so I suppose that, yeah, so tell us about Emancipation of the Mind and about how your ideas shifted between the two books.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not conscious of any big shift. I am, though, conscious of the fact that my knowledge and awareness of what was going on among the abolitionists definitely increased. I mean, part of the reason why I write books is because it gives me an opportunity to learn about whole new fields. And so, I'm definitely aware of some change and growth there, but I wouldn't say that I've changed my view of the Constitution, because, as I'm pretty sure I said in Nature's God, I actually think that the 1868 Constitution, as it were, the post-Civil War Constitution, is first of all, I think it's a new Constitution. It's pitched as a set of amendments
Mm.
13th, 14th, 15th Amendments to the United States Constitution, and historians have basically kind of, swept over that very quickly. But I think that in a fundamental sense, it was a new constitution. But what made it new, paradoxically, is that it came closer to the spirit of the Declaration of Independence. And in fact, you'll find in the 14th Amendment that you have a paraphrase of the Declaration of the Independence inserted into the Constitution. And the reason for that is that the Constitution from 1787, look, it was a mixed bag. It was a sausage. And unfortunately, what happened between 1787 and 1860 is that the sausage went very, very bad. I mean, and some of the flaws were there at the beginning, and some of the flaws were there precisely because that more genuinely revolutionary spirit of 1776 by 1787 had already receded. The reactionaries had, gotten rid of the Pennsylvania Constitution and set up a new, much more conservative approach, and there was much more consolidation of existing power structures going on at that point. That said, I think that they, it could have turned out differently, and I think a lot of why that Constitution turned out to be not so great was the consequence of things that happened it was it was created. I don't think that the rise of slavery, of cotton-based slavery in the South was foreordained. I don't think the people who wrote the Constitution thought it was going to happen. I thought I really do think that they thought it was going to end and die of natural causes. So the idea that they created this Constitution simply to expand the slave system, I think, is just false. That said, they created a Constitution that at the end of the day made that sort of expansion and oppressive system possible.
Mm.
Not just possible, but in some ways they made it easy, with all sorts of clauses that made it possible for the slaveholders to entrench their power.
Mm.
So perhaps here's one thing that I think where I shifted a bit. I do think that the idea of a written constitution, probably when I was focusing on the American Revolution, I thought that really was a critical development, right? And I think historically it is, because up to that time, most constitutions really in the world are in the British model, right? Which is no one ever bothers to write it down. And it just is kind of, it's a euphemism for the way we do things around here. I thought that the idea of a formal written constitution was a pretty decisive breakthrough. And I think now I'm a little more tempered on that. I mean, I think it's a breakthrough for sure. I think it's important to articulate the foundations of society, but it also is very much open to abuse. I mean, what makes a constitution living and what really makes it important is not the fact that our ancestors 250 years ago wrote down this stuff on a piece of paper. I mean, that's kind of ridiculous. I mean, why would anybody want to be governed by what a bunch of men in silk stockings wrote 250 years ago, right? What makes it relevant and binding is that it's essentially the oath or the vision that we sign up to, that we actively sign up to. We say, yes, I'm a part of this system that's governed by this Constitution. That's what it's our vow, as it were, that makes it relevant and alive and something that's worth enforcing. But if it can easily be captured by reactionary forces who say, oh, I don't really care what you say, because back in 1787, this is what James Madison meant, so we're going to do what Jimmy wanted us to do, and that I think is kind of preposterous.
Well, that's that's a whole other discussion, I suppose. I mean, personally, I would rather like to see a written constitution for Britain. I think our constitution is just rotten to the core. But I'm very much on the side of written constitutions, despite the problems that you outlined. But going back to the American Civil War and the Second American Revolution, in what ways did this radical philosophy motivate people like Douglas and Lincoln? And I know you deal with it in the book, but as a challenge, then isn't the Titanic figure of John Brown, a complete disproof of your thesis of radical philosophy? He's I mean, there's no way around it. That guy was definitely uh, formally religious in every sort of way.
Yeah, well, let me first qualify this stuff about John Brown, because it's definitely true that he was kind of an Old Testament style Christian, Bible, regularly spouting the Bible and that sort of thing. Um, but he's a lot more complicated than that. He himself said that what brought him to abolitionism was his encounter with these infidel abolitionists, not with the religious people. And in fact, what also motivated him was a complete rejection of the pro-slavery religion that he saw in churches. So, as a first very simple point, by his own testimony, whatever his own religious beliefs were, a key part of his motivation was this rejection of religion as he saw it being practiced, and his identification with infidels. Um, and related to that is that he used his religion as a way of essentially reinforcing his own moral conviction. And that's why the identification with the infidels was, in fact, I think, important for him, and why his rejection of the pro-slavery church was so important for him, because while he remained religious and committed to some form of biblical religion, he understood that to mean that he had an absolute right to enforce his moral vision and to try to take down slavery against what the religious authorities were saying. And I think you should add to the fact, add to that he was actually, he did actually read fairly widely and deal with all sorts of people. He was. It's kind of a curious thing, but just before going after Harper's Ferry, he was found with a copy of Thomas Paine's work. I think it was The Age of Reason, but it might have been, or maybe it was The Rights of Man. Maybe it was The Rights of Man. I'm not sure, but this is a guy who's reading a lot of stuff, and he's spending time with people like Frederick Douglass, who admires him intensely, even though he also sees that he's got a bit of a prophet streak. So that's John Brown. Let me also say that I'm by no means suggesting that that the only people motivated to oppose slavery were infidels and atheists. Not at all. I mean, in fact, there are huge crowds of religiously motivated abolitionists. My claim there is rather that the proportions have been really, really misrepresented. So when you read most summaries of the period, you'll get something like, oh, a bunch of religious people looked at their Bibles and they looked at slavery, and then they realized slavery is not a good thing, and so they started opposing slavery. I mean, that's kind of the snapshot history you get, and that is an inversion of the truth. There were some people who looked at their religion and saw in it a good argument against slavery, and they were a minority of abolitionists. Most people who were very religious ended up supporting the slave system. That's just a sort of statistical fact. And frankly, you can see it, a similar dynamic play out now. I mean, it's not that all white evangelicals are pro-Trump in the United States now. There's a good 20% who are not supporting Trump, right? But let's also look at the number, right? 80% do. And I think that you could probably get a similar ratio if you looked at the world of abolitionism. And then an important related claim, which also gets lost in a lot of the history writing, is that in the public mind, I'm talking about in newspapers and in media and so on, abolitionists at the time were identified as infidels. And this is something that I think is just, it's so well attested by the facts, and it's so ignored in the history that, you'll just have to excuse me for jumping up and down and just pointing at this very simple fact, because most of the history on this is just totally wrong. I mean, when abolitionists came to the attention of the general public, they were always almost instantly identified as being non-religious, as being infidels, atheists, unbelievers, bad people. That's just who they were. I mean, that's how they were identified. Now, some of them identified themselves very differently. They said, no, 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 I'm a true believer. I'm the real Christian here. But that's a reality. But anyway, that's the religious section of it. But then I think it's really important to actually look at the abolitionists who mattered, right? The ones who, and by mattered, I don't mean the ones who are necessarily the loudest in saying slavery is a bad thing. I mean the ones who are most effective in actually changing things. Now, John Brown was definitely a big part of that. He was, he definitely mattered. But who else mattered? Well, for one, the people who funded John Brown obviously mattered. The people who organized, made his kind of thing possible. Who were those people? Well, I would say that number 1, 2, and 3 on that list would probably be Theodore Parker, Frederick Douglass, and Frederick Douglass's friend, possible romantic partner, Audley Assing. Those are people who these were abolitionists. These were abolitionists who mattered. One of the ways they mattered was in influencing John Brown and in making his work possible. But they had, dramatic effects in other ways too. They really moved things forward. In the case of Theodore Parker, he won't be familiar to most of your, probably to any of your listeners. He was Abraham Lincoln's, let's say, favorite philosopher, favorite religious minister, although, again, he was a religious minister who was excommunicated from his own church, so very much an infidel, very much part of the radical philosophical tradition. He not only influenced Lincoln, but he also, and actually just to round out the influence on Lincoln, a lot of the things that we associate with Lincoln, the great phrases, that a government of, by, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Well, those words actually were Theodore Parker's words. So he mattered. He mattered a lot. Frederick Douglass mattered a lot in the abolitionist struggle. And he mattered during the war because he was then involved in recruiting Black soldiers for the Union Army. So these people, what was their kind of intellectual journey? And there's a pretty consistent pattern. It's that they start off religious. Theodore Parker and Frederick Douglass, when they were teenagers, they saw the light and they had conversations with God or whatever, and they thought they were saved. And then they couldn't explain slavery. They couldn't understand how this could happen. It didn't make sense to them as a system. And in order to see what was actually happening, to see how slavery worked, not just to understand that it's a bad thing. I think, most people can kind of tell right away that when something's bad like that, but to understand why it was bad and why something bad can continue, well, they had to read around. They had to, try to make sense of the world in a broader way. And how did they do that? Well, one of the really important things that they did, something that really changed them, was to take up philosophy. They read philosophy, they discussed it, and they rethought, what it means to have a just society. And those ideas, it's not that they sort of, found some, basic principle, it's justice, and now I will go implement. It's rather that their encounter with those ideas helped clear the path for them, helped them see what was actually happening in front of them. You have to remember that the slave system comes with all these incredible prejudices. I mean, it comes with this idea that not just that some people are meant to rule and that other people are meant to obey, not just that, people of one skin color are somehow better than people of another skin color. It also comes with, other ideas about how, human society can only work through command, that you can only be, good and do useful work if you are being obedient, and not if you're following your own initiative, that wealth comes from, beating people up and squeezing as much work out of them as you can. All these other things are they come with the slave system. And in order to see past them and see through them and understand that you can build a society without that kind of hierarchy, a society that doesn't rest on a mudsill, as the pro-slavery theologians argued. Well, to do that, to see that, it just helps a lot to read crazy German philosophers.
Yeah. Well, that was my next question. As it happens, you mentioned Ottilie Assing, who's a fascinating figure. I wasn't familiar with her before I read the book, but she's brilliant. She introduced Frederick Douglass to a lot of this German philosophy. I think, yeah, you talk about it in the book that in 1859, in the summer of 1859, she picks up some Feuerbach in a bookshop and takes it to Douglas, and they spend the summer reading it and discussing it. And just as a side note, it occurred to me that 1859 was a really interesting year in terms of human emancipation. You had John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, The Origin of Species, and Ottilie Assing and Frederick Douglass reading Feuerbach. So yeah, what was the influence of these German philosophers? Because they took the radical philosophy that had animated the American Revolution and then been extinguished there. They took it up in Europe and eventually brought it back to America. So there's this flow of radical philosophy across the continents. So I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and by the way, there's some great scholarship out there on Ottilie Assing, and I borrowed from it. I didn't discover her. I just made use of some great material that's out there. And although I did also look into her writings for these German magazines, really interesting stuff. I mean, she was really quite a dynamo. So the broader story I want to tell is one that I think has been lost in some of the micro history that people have been putting forward. I mean, I understand the academics need to kind of, say it's all more complicated and there's no grand narratives that really work. Well, here's a grand narrative that we shouldn't throw out, and it's this, that there were revolutions in the early modern world. And the initial starting ones were the American Revolution and the revolution in Haiti, which was, I guess people would include the French. It's just that the French one, as we all know, kind of went really bad. Those revolutions mattered, but they also were only partial successes. And in Europe, the reaction triumphed in the immediate aftermath of this influence of these revolutions in the provinces. And a tremendous amount of tension built up. There were huge undercurrents of liberal thought. I think most of German philosophy has been misunderstood. It's sort of, we see it now as kind of this sort of romantic, quasi-religious project, in the early 19th century, but that's because we're reading it on the surface. If you think about why it was happening and where it was happening, this was clearly an effort of people to burst free, and they couldn't burst free in politics, so they burst free in the cultural sphere as much as they could. So they were building up this tremendous kind of reservoir of radical thought in Europe. That then exploded onto the political stage in 1848. Where you had this series of revolutions. No one can quite explain how it is that these revolutions that started off in like Italy and Switzerland and then the streets of Paris, somehow they just spread over all of Europe. And every country was having its little revolution. Now, most of them failed. They failed in the short term. On the other hand, if your term is sort of like 100 years and you go to the post-World War II period, you could argue, well, it just took a long time for them to succeed. But in any case, they were really important. They failed. So these radical ideas that came from the American Revolution, they kind of went underground in Europe. They briefly exploded on stage, failed again. Some of them then came back to the United States. They came back just in time because there was essentially a need for a second revolution in the United States. The slave system had captured the American Republic. It was now essentially on the road to becoming a quasi-fascist slaveholding oligarchy. These radical ideas that came from America originally, well, you can argue they came from early modern Europe, went to America, went back to Europe, they came back. And they mattered. And I will say that they matter, and I don't care what I'm told about how it's all just boils down to the exchange of funds or something like that, or some other kind of very simplistic materialistic explanation, because I think the ideas did matter. And they shaped the course of the struggle in the United States. didn't shape it enough, in fact, because, had people been more alert to what was really happening, to the real sort of ideological foundations of the Second American Revolution, I don't think Reconstruction would have been such a catastrophe. It would have, some people got it, but they just didn't have quite enough power to see it through. So,
Yeah. Well, that speaks to the cycles of revolution and counter-revolution that you discuss. Post the first American Revolution, you have religious slave-holding oligarchy, which engages in a counter-revolution. And again, after the Civil War, after the Emancipation, you have a great disappointment really afterwards. You end up with Jim Crow and all the rest of it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really important chapter, and I wish I had time for another book, but I don't think I do on that. Other people have tackled this. So why did Reconstruction fail in that way? And I think the important thing to know is that it didn't have to fail. I mean, there were people at the time who understood how you could make it right. And they actually put some ideas on the table that would have made it right. And for me, it's really simple, but the 40 acres and a mule thing, which I mentioned at some point, that's the program where you would have taken the land that these slave-holding oligarchs had amassed into a massive concentration of wealth. You would have taken that land and redistributed it to the population at large, and that would have meant the enslaved population, and also, of course, the yeoman farmers who were often landless or very impoverished in the South too. And had that happened, I think the American history would have been a very, very different thing. But the former slaveholding oligarchs had the power. They were able to collude with the northern elites to make sure that kind of redistribution didn't happen. But I think people should know that it wasn't impossible. It wasn't some kind of like socialist utopian fantasy. There were congressmen, Republican congressmen in the 1860s, including Thaddeus Stevens, who's probably one of the most underestimated players in American political history, who put it forward as a concrete plan.
Mm.
He also put forward another idea, which they should have taken up, which is let's not keep these old states. I mean, keeping the old states suggests that they never really seceded, that they still have some legitimacy. No, they should have essentially reorganized those territories into new, different states and said, we're going to build a new world out there. And revolutions often go bad. Revolutions often, are troubled with utopian visions that cause problems. But that would have been an example of a very, very pragmatic change that would have been not so hard to implement at that time, and that would have had a dramatic effect on U.S. history. And it didn't happen because it was not it was not yet, it never really is a complete democracy. It was still ruled by small cliques of people.
And along with that, there goes the rewriting of history as well. The Parson Weems effect, Washington, the pious praying in Valley Forge, and all of that. Lincoln being a really devout religious person. John Brown, he was just a lunatic, as opposed to a wild man, but a man with a strategic vision and some learning in these philosophical ideas. And you see the same kind of happening later on with the civil rights movement, with Martin Luther King and others. We see the civil rights movement as largely a matter of religious conscience rebelling against the racist system that was in place. But that ignores a lot of the people like Philip Randolph. There was movers and shakers in the civil rights movement who were atheists, who were non-believers, who were secularists. And you also point out as well in the book that Martin Luther King himself borrowed a line from Theodore Parker about the arc of the moral universe. So would you say that period was another revolutionary period where those ideas surfaced again, only to be buried away and rewritten again?
Yeah. So on the sort of civil rights struggle, I think a couple of sort of counterintuitive points I would make, or points that run against a lot of the conventional history, are that first, as you say, it's too simplistic to suggest that it was all driven by religious motivations. And that's one narrative that's imposed on the civil rights struggle. And it's, and it does depart from this basic reality that almost all of the organization, especially of the Black community in support of civil rights, was passing through church-related organizations and made use of religious rhetoric and religious themes. But it's far too simplistic to say that it was essentially a religious movement, and in some ways it's a misrepresentation. First basic point is that a fundamental reason why a lot of the movement passed through religious organizations is because those were the only organizations that were allowed to exist at the time, and through which Black people were able to work together, collaborate. So it was when government is not there to help you, when community is there to exclude you, when you've got essentially no other institutions or structures that are going to help you, well, then you go to church, and the church does it for you. A second important point to bear in mind is that a lot of the theology coming out of the American churches, the Black American churches, is not quite as conventional or orthodox as people imagine. Some of it's fundamentalist, but a fair amount, and the part that I would say that people like Martin Luther King represent is not fundamentalist, and is quite in some ways heretical. It often rejected the kind of the authoritarian style of theology that was characteristic of the pro-slavery church, and it often drew on liberal theologians. And the best case in point of that is, Martin Luther King clearly was interested in Theodore Parker. I mean, that's how he got his famous line about the arc of the moral universe. That was Theodore Parker, and Martin Luther King brought that up and used it to explain the struggle in which he was engaged. So I think the movement is much more complex than people imagine, on the side of the people who openly invoked religion. And then don't forget that there were a significant number of people involved in the civil rights struggle who were in fact infidels or atheists or Jewish. So there was the idea that it was all some kind of religious movement, I think is fundamentally false. And here's the final point I'll make. So here's like a little anecdote. I can't quite remember the exact detail, but sometime in the 1950s, there was a gathering of ministers from the southern states in Tennessee, and they voted overwhelmingly to reject, I think it was like 8-1, to reject a declaration on human rights. Now you have to ask yourself, why would a gathering of holy ministers, avowed Christians, want to reject a Declaration of Human Rights? Well, it's very straightforward. The Declaration of Human Rights was essentially seen as a pro-civil rights gesture. It was essentially seen as granting equal rights to Black citizens in those states. And the overwhelming majority of white religionists in the South were adamantly hostile to civil rights, and they saw that hostility as being grounded in their religion. I mean, the biggest opposition, this is something that people don't get. If you want to present the civil rights as a religious, awakening, well, how about you represent the reaction to it, which, by the way, we're still living through, for what it was, which was a religious reaction. I mean, it was the founders of the current Christian nationalist movement in the United States, the same movement that's bringing us Trump, that's bringing us MAGA, that's bringing us coup attempts and all that crap. That movement is grounded on the religious side of the anti-civil rights struggle. So representing, this civil rights thing as, once again, people seeing Jesus and realizing that you got to treat all people equal, that's just a false representation. And it's something that, it's a forward backward thing. And it's, it's the kind of thing that makes you appreciate the history moves very, very slowly. I don't think we should be total pessimists. I think it has moved forward. We're better off now than we were in the early 19th century. Trust me, just read some of the stuff from the people writing back then. Read read Frederick Douglass's description of his own captivity. But history does move forward, but it's very, very slow, and it moves backward an awful lot.
Well, since you bring up Donald Trump, um, as you say, he's kind of the representation of this counter-revolutionary movement. Um, Recently, I interviewed Jared Huffman, U.S. representative, the only open non-believer in Congress, about Project 2025, which he is helping to lead the charge against. So, at the risk of, we're a little over a month away from the US election. Do you want to make any
You want me to predict or what?
How do you think things will?
Yeah, well, this video might be around afterwards, so I don't
Oh no, it'll be out before, but but yeah,
Yeah,
what?
I feel joy. I feel joy. Yeah, it's not going to surprise anybody that I'm not a Trump supporter, and I certainly hope that he's defeated. And my reading of the situation now is that that is the likely outcome.
Hmm.
But we'll find out in a month, so I'm not sure that there's much value in me saying now what's going to happen. Um, let me address something though that in connection with the Project 2025 and the current American movement. So when I said that my book, The Emancipation of the Mind, it's describing a part of history that I think is still relevant. I think that's a really, good example. And I should point out that my book was written well before Project 2025 came into existence. But it does reflect some of the issues and the dynamics that I describe taking place in the 19th century. And we see it happening now. Here's like a little tidbit, a little mini factoid. It's not totally accurate, in term it can be overinterpreted, but where the original who the original wokesters were? There was this group called the Wide Awakes in 1860, and it was mostly young men who would go out in the middle of the night wearing raincoats covered in oil and carrying lanterns, and saying that they were wide awake, they were woke. And the cause that they were basically representing was Lincoln, the Republican Party, and a kind of union of the working classes, including enslaved people, against the rule of the oligarchs. So they were they were what the conservatives today would call a woke a woke movement. And these were important in helping Lincoln get elected. They weren't the decisive factor, but they contributed to something that was very significant, which is that his election did actually represent a very partial, very imperfect kind of movement on the part of pretty ordinary people to try to assert their rights against a nasty oligarchy, and they self-identified as woke. And here's the other part of the equation: it's that the Southern oligarchs and also many of the Northern elites hated their guts. They hated these wokesters. Why? Because they represent a threat to their privilege, to their order, and their power. They don't quite put it that way, though. They basically say all these people, and let's just shuffle the wokesters in with the abolitionists. They're infidels, they're non-believers, they are, social justice warriors, they're nasty people, and what we need to do is crush them and impose order, and we impose it by enforcing our conservative principles. That was the vision of the Southern oligarchs. And that's what's happening now. That's what's happening in Project 2025. It's basically a group of reactionaries. The intellectuals there are motivated mainly by their resentment of their fellow intellectuals and the people who didn't give them tenure and all of it. The liberals on campus who spurned them and wouldn't date them or whatever. But the people funding it are, playing the role of the Southern slave-holding oligarchs. And what they want is to get rid of signs of reason, signs of thoughtful policy formation. They want to eliminate government as an active agent on behalf of the people, so that they can then turn it into an instrument that enforces their own power and privilege. And that's what Project 2025 promises. And it provides a really nice, kind of almost picture perfect blend of what the Southern oligarchs did in the 19th century. It provides a perfect blend of a religious agenda, right, where they say we're defending true values. We're everything should be based on the Bible. And by the way, I have read most of Project 2025. I've read the bits. If you look at the Department of Labor, it basically starts off by saying God gave us the right to work, and we're here to reinforce our God-given right to work. And by the way, God wants us to work and have families where the women will have all the babies that they get pregnant with and all that, right? So it's it's quite amazing that it's totally infused with this religious nationalist ideology, and that's combined with a utterly regressive ideology that says, oh, we're pro-market, but of course pro-market means pro the existing oligarchies, pro the existing arrangement of economic resources, and very much against any kind of antitrust regulation, against any kind of regulation that would protect the environment, that would protect public good, and so on. So it is to some degree a repeat of history, and we'll see if after this election we have to go through another cycle. Or we can move on.
Yeah, just to confirm, how long do you have left? I don't want to keep you any longer than you're able.
No, I mean I'm fine. Whatever you want to do. Although perhaps we should wrap up soon, because I mean I'm sure that your people don't want to hear me blabbing on for too long.
Well, yeah, well, just on that, I've only got a few little questions left. But just on that point about the wokesters and everything, yeah, I'm completely with you. Though I think also we do have to be aware. I think you do it in your book. You sort of take on the quote unquote wokesters who do down the achievements of the American Revolution and the refounders and so on, who come up with the white Enlightenment trope and all of that.
Yeah. If I may say, I mean that's why probably nobody likes me, because I mean I'm very hostile to that perspective, and I think it's such a damaging thing for anybody who believes in justice and progress. I mean, to basically throw out everything that's been achieved in America, and to throw out this long history of remarkable individuals with really interesting radical ideas, to just throw that out and say, oh, they're all just racist. Oh, it's all just this kind of endless oppression. I think that's just it's a travesty of the facts, but it's also just bad, bad politics. It's a bad way of trying to get anything good done in the world.
Yeah, and of course, one of the main figures of that period was a guy who is pretty prominent in your book, Toussaint Louverture, the Haitian revolutionary leader, who was black, obviously. So the idea that the Enlightenment, and he was, a big fan of the Enlightenment. And saying that, it just occurs to me that that's another way in which history is repeating itself, is the fear of Haiti, which has become something of a trope on the American right at the moment, let's say.
That's right.
But yeah, one other thing that I wanted to go back to quickly was you say that Lincoln was perhaps the only Marxist president. So I don't know if you want to comment on the relationship between Marx and Lincoln, and Marx and the US, which is quite an interesting and understudied or underappreciated topic.
It's really underappreciated. So a first thing that probably most people don't know is that Marx really liked America's founders. He really thought they were great. And he thought Lincoln was even better than most of the founders. So, I mean, there's a tremendous admiration, and he really thought that what they were doing was advancing a democratic revolution that would end up helping working people. So that's a first point. Second point is that Marx issued quite a few analyses of the Civil War, of the struggle over slavery, and then the Civil War. And they're remarkably perceptive analyses. I mean, he really gets a lot of what's going on there. And so did many of his American readers, because it turns out that he wrote 467 or something like that articles for the New York Tribune in that period. So he's a pretty significant figure in that time, and he's a useful source for historians because he provides analysis and he gets it. And by the way, his analysis often overlaps with that of John Stuart Mill, right? So, you know, interesting bedfellows. Now about Lincoln. So Lincoln was, I think, in his background, in his bones, and his beliefs, he was a man of labor. In some fundamental sense. I mean, he believed in work, he believed in working, he believed in people getting paid for their work. He thought that was kind of the basis of American society and American democracy. And I think that he has some very famous and interesting quotes where he says, capital is secondary to labor. Everything comes from human work, and some of it gets stored up in capital. Sure, it's useful stuff, but what really matters at the end of the day is labor, and making sure that people get fair compensation for their labor, which is fundamental to his analysis of what's wrong with slavery. So it's in that sense that he is a Marxist president. He's not a Marxist president in that he doesn't subscribe to the labor theory of value, which Marx puts forward, which isn't really defensible. He doesn't subscribe to Marx's rather simplistic and false analysis of surplus value or of the class structure. I mean, he's a believer in the American idea where you can sort of work your way up through the classes. He's not into the proletarian revolution. So I mean, it's obviously an overstatement to say that he's a Marxist because we associate all these other things with Marxism that would not pertain to Lincoln. But he's very much a Marxist in that sense of putting labor first and believing that we have to organize our politics around this sort of respect for labor. And there are other senses too, by the way, but they get a little philosophical. I mean, I think Marx was to some degree indebted to Hegel, to the idea of the importance of recognition in people sort of and how people understand themselves and act in the world. And I think Lincoln had a lot of that too, but that's a little more abstract. But yeah, I say it partly to be provocative, but partly in a pretty serious way. And by the way, to connect it with the American right, American right, the new right has become a kind of sad little enterprise. I mean, it's sad, but unfortunately, it has a chance of ruling the world. But one of its many travesties is that it sort of identifies itself with Lincoln, who, in fact, stands for pretty much the opposite of the sort of rule of the oligarchy and of the unthinking embrace of so-called principles. And slavish adherence to some magical constitution of 1787, that kind of thing. But I digress.
I think, if I remember rightly, I think Marx he thought the US would be the great engine of revolution in the world, whilst Russia would be the great bulwark of reactionary autocracy, which is a bit of an irony considering what happens in the 20th century. But that aside, I suppose one final thing I wanted to ask was if you're familiar with the historian Tom Holland and his book Dominion, which is it's a subject that I'm very interested in right now. I call it the
more
new.
about the book because I don't think I've read it, but just tell me what's the Dominion about?
It's well, essentially the thesis is that Christianity is responsible for everything good in the world. Um, I call it I didn't coin the term, but I've taken the term on that. I call it new theism. There's this phenomenon right now where a lot of, especially conservative thinkers, who base a lot of their stuff on Holland's book, say that basically we need a Christian underpinning for Western civilization. Without that, we're at the mercy of the woke and China and Russia and so on and so forth. I think Holland puts it, he says that we're swimming in Christian waters, whether we want to believe it or not. So all of these concepts of human rights and even secularism, and even gay rights is essentially founded upon Christianity. Which is kind of the opposite, I think, to your thesis. So
I haven't, so I don't think I have read that book, although maybe I've seen some notices of it. But I think I didn't read it because that argument is so familiar and it's been around for so long, and it is in fact the standard trope of conservative intellectuals. I would say, at least going back to Alasdair MacIntyre, and it has antecedents well before that. And the basic argument is that, oh, we're just Christian all the way through and through, and even when we're, pretending not to be, we're still somehow, rooted in these things. And what can I say about it other than it's completely and totally wrong? And it also is a repetition of the kind of classic anti-liberal trope that's used to suppress people and establish authoritarian systems. I mean, that's what I think that is. And it's resurgent now precisely because, we're in a phase where authoritarian systems have appeal and may well succeed. Why does this happen? Because you get a social system that starts to break down. It breaks down not because of wokesters and liberal ideas running amok. It breaks down because you have massive economic inequality, because you have unjust social systems and systems of privilege that make it hard for people to feel that their lives are run in a reasonable way. So they turn around and look for some roots, they look for some foundation, and these intellectuals are happy to supply it in some kind of mythical, deep foundation of society, which in fact has no real basis in any real understanding of the history or the way in which societies work and so on. It's just this kind of superstition that, oh, we're all, because our ancestors were Christian, we're all Christian too. And it appeals in times like these, and it ultimately leads to the support of reactionary parties that promise to do something for the little people, but ultimately have the effect of entrenching privilege and power. I mean, that's what the national conservatism movement is about now. It's sad. I wish there were a way to help these people out of their thing, but you see, part of it, I understand the psychology. It's that, they feel that things are unstable, they're uncertain. And for that reason, they just as, some people reach for the strong man, they reach for the strong theology. But it's kind of like going for the bottle of whiskey when what you really need is a good shower and and a fresh meal, right?
I should,
So
should say that I don't think Tom Holland is particularly reactionary or conservative. I think he's reasonably fluffy. Um,
yes, but that basic idea. So you remember I was talking about, the common conceptions of things, right? And how radical philosophy breaks from that. I mean, that to me is, however fluffy he is in his actual, political positions, the basic conception that he's putting forward is one that is completely grounded in the common conception of things. It's grounded in this idea that people will only be moral if they are forced, compelled to obey some supernatural authority. And so therefore they will only, embrace principles. They'll only be nice to one another if they believe there's some man up in the sky with a beard who's going to punish them if they don't. They'll only be able to talk to one another if they agree that they're going to meet in church on Sunday. It's a certain way of understanding how human society arises, how it works, how morality works. And I sympathize with it because I think it's kind of almost sort of built into the way humans think, the way the experience works, but it's wrong. And the tremendous achievement of the revolutions of the early modern world is that enough people saw enough about what was wrong with that system in order to get rid of the kings, in order to get rid of this idea that you need to have a society grounded on a church run by a corrupt priestly hierarchy. You don't need that. In fact, that gets in the way. You can actually set up a different form of government that, yeah, it's harder to explain. It's harder to explain to most people how and why it works. I mean, how is it that we can have a society in which people don't agree on, which white man with the beard is ruling us and so on? How is it that we can have a society in which, different people have, radically incompatible belief systems and yet they work together? Well, it does work. We know that it works. but it's hard to explain, and it's much easier for demagogues to say, no, no, we all need to kind of get in line and, share our common creed, and if we don't, things fall apart. If things are falling apart now, that's because we lack this common creed. The only way we can get it back is to kind of reinforce it and have this kind of, Christian or Christian light or whatever, your preferred theological flavor is, make sure that everybody shares it and enjoys it, because that's the only foundation of society. And what can I say is that, other than that's been refuted in history, and I just hope that more people understand that, because the more people understand it, the more that they will reject the idea that we have to go back to it. Now, if I can just finish off now with something that, people who sort of write that kind of stuff, they have a couple of predictable tropes. One is, oh, the Protestant Reformation, that's where the individual kind of came into being. So everything comes back to the Protestant Reformation. In that moment where the individual triumphed, and that's pure Christianity, and so therefore everything's based on Christianity. So there are plenty of people who've argued that line, and I won't mention the specific authors because they all say the same thing. It's a paradox, because then you have another group, the sort of hardcore Catholic intellectuals, who say, no, 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 actually the real foundation is the medieval church. That's when society and religion and government were all united and everyone shared this common vision. And to all of that, I wish I could invite people to come back to the 14th, 15th, 12th centuries and see what was actually happening, because it was not a united society. It was not a happy place. I mean, look how the whole Inquisition project got started. It was mostly with the suppression of the Cathars in the 12th century, 12th and 13th centuries in France. It was brutal. It was nasty. There was no, unified vision of how society should work. There was no agreement that it's all founded on the Christian religion. It was just a bloody, brutal, vicious place where you have, local chieftains warring with one another and figuring out how much they can rape and pillage before they get killed themselves. And the Reformation, most of the philosophers and thinkers who actually mattered in shaping things like the American Revolution and the ideas that actually govern us today, most of them were being brutally oppressed by representatives of this Reformation. Most of them were reacting against it and its incredible dogmatism. I mean, look at the way Calvin governed his little cult in Switzerland. I mean, my goodness, the idea that this is somehow the foundation of our society gets me. It really annoys me. But I know we're doomed to hear lots of that kind of stuff. And by the way, many of those people, they're going to get very well paid, much better paid than I am, because they're going to get hired by the think tanks who want to kind of, go out there and promote this idea that Western civilization all depends on some combination of Jesus and Aristotle. And if you can write a book that proves that, well, they're going to give you, they're going to give you the support you need, and then they're going to send it out to all the little people, and everyone will line up, and they'll all kind of, go around saying, yes, we're founded on the Christian religion, and let's go ahead with our neo-medieval quasi-fascist project. So yeah, well, it bothers me, but thanks for bringing it up.
Yeah, well, I think it's a good answer. It does annoy me as well that there are people on the left, liberals, who also kind of fall for it as well, like Slavoj Zizek, who's got a book out called Christian Atheism. I think they kind of want to hitch their wagon to this because maybe it's a way to a tactical maneuver, perhaps a way to I don't know, try and stop the right from claiming this heritage. Therefore, we have to do the same. So we all have to try and hitch our wagons to this to get across what we want to do. But anyway, it's
look, neither the left nor the right has a monopoly on stupid ideas, and
yeah.
I mean, intellectuals in general tend to go for these kind of big schemes that promise to save society if you just reground it on one idea or another. Whereas just to be clear, because I mean, I'm pushing a certain kind of agenda, but the basic vision of a liberal society that I favor is one in which we, consistent with the simplest ideas of liberalism, means that we don't actually have to agree on some broader theological narrative or some deep foundation for all our values in order to have a good society.
Mm.
Not only do we not need to, but we shouldn't even really try to do that. We should, in fact, just focus on understanding the world around us.
I think that's a good place to end. Sorry for keeping you a bit longer with that little
No, thank you, Daniel.
side quest.
I'm glad
But yeah,
to.
books highly recommended, and thanks again for taking the time to
Okay.
talk to me for a little while.
Well, thanks for hearing me out. I appreciate it.